I still see folks trickling in, so I'm going to hold for just a few more seconds and let everyone get settled. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is Taylor Bilbrey and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for the public record. Office hours recordings are available on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. A copy of the slide deck and the recording will be emailed to you by your grant administrator or your annual representative. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers if possible throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. For our agenda today, we have some ESG and ESG-CV updates, office hour updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESG-CV question and answer, and a spotlight session. I don't believe we have any ESG updates. However, feel free to jump in if we do. I will give a few seconds for each of these slides just as our weekly reminders. All right, so for our ESG-CV updates, just a big reminder that our expenditure milestone is approaching for January 31st, 2023. All ESG-CV grantees must have expended at least 75% of their total award by that time. Financial reports with actual amounts spent must be submitted no later than January 31st, 2023. Some additional updates. So reminders for those milestones, all program funds for projects, including all the listed components, shall be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and admin costs shall be expended by October 31st, 2023. All final RFFs should be submitted to the department by November 15th, 2023. We also have a call for success stories out right now. So HCD is collecting success stories for the ESG-CV grant. If you have a success story from one of your providers or programs that you would like to share, please email it to your grant administrator. And remember not to use any PII in your submission. So we have a non-HCD training opportunity, preventing fatal overdose in homeless service programs. So this will be a 90-minute webinar from the California Department of Public Health. We'll introduce some principles and techniques for prevention and reversal, explain some legal protections around overdose reversal in California, share firsthand stories from providers in the field and allow time for Q&A, discuss caring for staff and clients after an overdose, empower webinar participants with information, resources, and supplies. So you can click here once you get the slides to register if you haven't already. Some HCD office hour updates. So we have the written standards and policies procedures for today. Next week we have ESG-CV grant sunset. On the 16th of November, we have ESG and ESG-CV contract amendment process. And coming up on December 7th, we have ESG outcomes. And you can also find the link to those training resources to register in the slides once they're sent out. Some additional trainings we have upcoming are on the tour, that one passed. So on that one passed, so those have passed. We have one coming up on the 3rd for case management best practices and housing stabilization. So feel free to register using the link in that slide, and someone may be dropping those in the chat right now. So we have some COVID resources, monkeypox resources, and some ESG resource links. So those links are always there for you. Any questions at this time? I will pause for just a moment.
Natalie, I see your hand was raised. Are you going to ask a question?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we're supposed to drop them in the box for everybody, or can I just say it? I'm not sure.
You can say it.
Okay, I got a email yesterday regarding the homeless solutions supplement. I guess there was like, I don't know, it said like maybe 3 or so million. And I was wondering if that was the leftover that could possibly be reallocated. And if it kind of showed me a link, and it was kind of late last night. So I was wondering if you guys would be touching base on that anytime today, or if there's somewhere I can go for some more information.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. This is Connie. Natalie, are you talking about the email that came over last night about the ESG CV reallocated money?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So that money will be going toward primarily rapid rehousing and some other activities.
Okay.
Connie, just so you're aware, Natalie is with the tribal grantee.
Okay.
Email she received might have been a little more specific. So Natalie, we can follow up with you after the fact to, answer any questions that you have about that offline.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. And just in case that question triggers anybody else's curiosity, as soon as we have more information on any kind of reallocation, your grant administrator you will be the first to know from your grant administrator. So just in case that sparked folks' curiosity. So if we have no other questions, I believe we can move into you all have our contact information. Feel free to reach out using the email listed or the best contact for your grant administrator. So we will jump right in. I know we have a lot of content today with our Spotlight Series presentation on ESG written standards versus policies and procedures. And I will hand it over to Gordon and Michael. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a lead homeless services specialist with ICF. Would my co-presenter like to introduce himself quickly?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he and him. I am white and Jewish, and I am also a lead homeless services specialist with ICF. Excited to be with you all.
Thank you, Gordon. As we just heard, we have a lot of content to cover, so I am going to jump right in. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about ESG written standards and how those are different from project level policies and procedures and the responsibilities associated with each of those depending on your position in the contracting process. Next slide, please. So first, let's talk about terminology because words matter. So when we say ESG written standards and when we say project level policies and procedures, what are we actually talking about with those two concepts? Next slide, please. So first, we'll talk about ESG written standards. These are required by the ESG program interim rule, which has some very specific things spelled out about them. As the state ESG recipient, California HCD is exercising its regulatory ability to pass responsibility for establishing ESG written standards down to subrecipients. So as the recipient of ESG funding in this context, California HCD bears the primary responsibility, but the regulation allows them to pass that to subrecipients, which they do. The regulatory language is not clear about whether subrecipients can further pass that down to sub-subrecipients. So for these purposes, we are not making a judgment on that because it is not something explicitly allowed. We are going to say, if you are a subrecipient of California HCD ESG funding, you are responsible for ESG written standards that has been passed to you. Written standards must be established for the area covered by a COC or an area over which ESG services are coordinated. So really the bottom line there is if you're one of those local government entities or another that receives ESG funding from HCD, then your written standards apply to the entire geographic area for which that funding is used, including any of your subrecipients. And then written standards must be applied consistently by all ESG projects in that area. So that's really where we're getting at this being a system thing. The written standards you develop at the subrecipient level apply to the entire geographic area and to all of your subrecipients. Next slide, please. So I do want to note a few things here. First, want to note that ESG written standards as defined by the ESG program interim rule are different from the continuum of care written standards defined in the continuum of care program interim rule. They are separate things. It is possible to combine ESG and COC written standards into one document, provided that the requirements of both interim rules are met. So that is something that can be done, but there is a lot of complexity there. For the purposes of our presentation today, we are only addressing ESG written standards. So the continuum of care written standards are outside of the scope of what we're addressing today. Next slide, please. So what must be in ESG written standards? I want to note up front here that based on the language in the ESG program interim rule, some of the things that are included in ESG written standards are, by definition, policies and procedures, which is a little confusing. But we are going to talk later in the presentation about how those things overlap and how that carries down into project level policies and procedures at an agency. So just keep in mind, we're going to dive into that a little deeper. When I say policies and procedures in this context, I am talking about the ones that are specifically required by the ESG program interim rule to be part of your written standards. It is not a comprehensive list of your project level policies and procedures. But standard policies and procedures for evaluating participant eligibility for assistance is the first one that's required. Standards for targeting and providing essential services related to street outreach. Policies and procedures for admission, diversion, referral, and discharge by emergency shelters assisted under ESG, etc. We have kind of limited time, so I'm not going to read that word for word. You can see it there on your screen, and you will get a copy of these after the fact. Policies and procedures for assessing, prioritizing, and reassessing needs for essential services related to shelter, and policies and procedures for coordination among shelter providers, essential service providers, homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing, and other homelessness assistance providers, and mainstream service and housing. Next slide, please. Further things that must be included in your ESG written standards. Policies and procedures for determining and prioritizing which eligible households will receive prevention and rapid rehousing, standards for determining what percentage or amount of rent and utilities each program participant must pay while they receive assistance, if any, standards for determining how long a particular program participant will be provided with rental assistance and whether and how that amount will be adjusted over time, and standards for determining the type, amount, and duration of housing stabilization or relocation services that's provided, including limits, if any, on prevention or rapid rehousing assistance that participants receive. So I just said a lot of things. You don't have to think through every one of these right now. We just wanted to point out the regulatory language. This is straight from the program interim rule, specifically telling you what needs to be in ESG written standards. So don't worry too much about internalizing all of it right now. Just be aware that it's there. Next slide, please. So some other notes here. Regulatory requirements for ESG written standards do require that some of the included items are detailed policies and procedures. That's what I was talking about at the beginning of the section. It does get confusing because some of them are by definition policies and procedures. However, the policies and procedures that you put into your written standards are applied at the system level, and they apply to all subrecipients. So these are not project level policies and procedures at a subrecipient agency. These are system-wide policies and procedures that apply to your entire ESG geography. Policies and procedures created at the project level are separate from written standards, and we are going to discuss how that is different as we go through this presentation. And we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Gordon to talk about policies and procedures.
Thanks, Mike. I love talking about policies and procedures, something that are a thing that is very different than written standards. So policies and procedures are a set of rules or guidelines for the organization and employees to follow in order to effectively operate a project. And for our purposes here, a project is any one instance at the organization level of a certain funding source within a certain project type. So for example, Acme Corporation, a sub-recipient operating a rapid rehousing implementation, all of their rapid rehousing through ESG in that bucket, we're referring to that as a project. And that's separate from, for example, if Acme Corporation also received emergency shelter money, the emergency shelter money would be a separate project. So those are two separate projects within the same organization and the same funding source. Policies and procedures are developed at the service provider level. So Acme Corporation is the one developing them, not their grantor, Acme County. They usually have some policies and procedures that are applicable to individual projects, so that are at the rapid rehousing level or at the emergency shelter level, while others that are multi-project or cross-cutting, and those have a tendency to be organization level, like financial policies and procedures, procurement policies and procedures, employee hiring policies and procedures, things like that. Generally speaking, policies and procedures should in theory allow a person who is in some way knowledgeable about, we're using competent here, but somebody who knows what's up, to reconstruct the project without outside guidance. So you should be able to pick up the policies and procedures at the project level and say, oh, I know how to do this, and then run the project. Next slide, please. So there is no standard list of everything that requires a policy or a procedure at a given agency. There are things that are common, but there's no list of what must be there, and there's no list of what should be there. Generally speaking, though, a good rule of thumb is that if it's something you do repeatedly or as a standard practice or as an important part of your project, you should probably have a written policy or procedure for doing it. Guidance and requirements on what have to be included in your P&Ps could in theory be provided by HCD or by your local COC or by the local government ESG subrecipient or other ESG subrecipient or any other funding source. The ESG program interim rule doesn't provide specifics, but your various funders and other entities sort of upstream may well do. Your agency policies and procedures are probably heavily informed by 2 CFR 200, sometimes called the Omni Circular for agencies that use federal funding, as 2 CFR 200 is the federal guideline for how to implement your federal funding sources in compliance with federal financial guidelines. Next slide, please. So a typical format for your policies and procedures. The question is always sort of, what are you trying to do? And you want to keep that up front at the beginning of your policy. So an example of this is, it's the policy of Acme Community Action Agency to evaluate participant households in its rapid rehousing project to determine the types and amounts of financial assistance required, and the procedural statement, which is how are you going to accomplish what the policy says it's going to do. So an example, and I'm going to read this whole thing off to you so the auditory learners in the audience get a hold of this, is an assigned Acme case manager will meet with each participant household within 1 day of project enrollment. The case manager will utilize ACME's internal questionnaire and any necessary supplemental questions to determine assets and housing barriers of the household. This information will be used to identify the types and amounts of ESG rapid rehousing financial assistance initially required by that household. The case manager will monitor the household's assets and barriers and make adjustments to the types and amounts of financial assistance provided throughout the duration of project enrollment. So the policy statement is, it's our policy to evaluate and reevaluate participants to determine how much financial assistance they receive based on needs and assets. And the procedure is, here is how we're going to do that. Next slide, please. Responsibility. Trying to figure out what the visual pun on the slide is. I'm going to noodle on that. Next slide, please. So who is responsible for which part of all of this? So HCD is primarily responsible for the ESG written standards, which it passes down to its subrecipients. HCD also provides guidance on required policies and procedures, which it does require under its own ESG program guidelines. For example, you will recently have seen policies coming out on the subject of this is your ESG rapid rehousing manual. This is your ESG emergency shelter manual. These have policy requirements in them, and those policy requirements trickle down to subrecipients. The local government subrecipient or other direct subrecipient from HCD must develop ESG written standards for the local area served by the ESG award. So all of those written standard requirements that Mike talked about that exist at the recipient level that are required by the ESG program interim rule, HCD passes those down to its direct subrecipients, and those direct subrecipients have to develop written standards that work for their region. Direct subrecipients must also develop policies and procedures if they are also a direct services provider. So if Acme County local government both receives ESG money and is a service provider, so they do rapid rehousing, for example, or they run an emergency shelter or whatever, they have to have both policies and procedures as a subrecipient. So those are going to be their written standards, as well as policies and procedures as a service provider. Finally, the local subrecipients must incorporate all of the ESG written standards and HCD requirements into their policies and procedures. So they're going to have, and this is the service provider level, they have to develop policies and procedures that incorporate the written standards from their subrecipient, so the folks that are granting the money directly, which is usually a local government, and HCD requirements all have to inform their policies and procedures. And those policies and procedures have to be developed both at an organizational level and at a project level. And I would add that many of those organization level policies probably already do exist. And the primary burden there is reviewing them to make sure that they do actually comply with anything that's being passed down from the ESG subrecipient or HCD. And a big one there, incidentally, is representation from people with lived experience, making sure that you comply with that requirement. Next slide, please. So what if you're a nonprofit and you get a direct grant from HCD? Well, number one, congratulations on your grant. Number two, you have to have ESG written standards at the agency level. So that subrecipient requirement is now yours because you are a direct subrecipient of HCD. You may adopt existing local ESG written standards as your own, nothing preventing that. If you've got something good locally, there's no reason not to take it. But you do have to have those written standards, whether you develop them or whether you borrow them from another local entity. And as with any other service provider, you have to incorporate the written standards and HCD requirements into your P&Ps. And those P&Ps must again exist at both project and the organization level. Next slide, please. So what if you are also a direct recipient of local ESG from HUD? So if you are a local government, and this is only local governments, if you are a local government that receives ESG entitlement funding directly from HUD, and you are also an ESG subrecipient of HCD, you have to have ESG written standards that meet both HUD requirements and any HCD requirements. This is an edge case situation. This is not true for most of you. In the cases for which it is true, you just need to be doubly careful that you are fulfilling your obligations both to HCD, subrecipient, and HUD, direct recipient. Next slide. And I think this is over to Mike, so I stole your thunder, buddy. Sorry about that.
No problem. I do want to note a couple of slides earlier when we said if you're a nonprofit organization that receives a direct grant. I had space limitations when I was developing that slide, but I want to note not just nonprofits, like if you're a tribal nation that receives funding directly from California HCD, that applies to you also. So just be aware of that as you're reviewing these when we send them out. And on this slide, so we just want to note, through all of this stuff we've gone through, the easiest way to ensure that you're meeting all of the requirements applicable to your agency and your project is to refer to your grant contract, refer to the federal guidance, and refer to guidance published by your funding sources, and that includes HCD. And you can always reach out to the appropriate representative that you work with there if you have questions. Next slide, please. Oh, look, I used the same picture. Sorry about that. That's terribly boring. Thank you. So written standards and policies and procedures do have overlap. We've said that several times throughout this presentation, and I'm going to keep saying it because it is an important thing to point out. We have to still look at them as separate concepts, even though there is some overlap. Next slide, please. The main thing that I want you to think about when we're thinking about how they interact with each other in that overlapping area is that the policies and procedures that are included in ESG written standards are going to carry down into project level policies and procedures. Because the ESG written standards govern all sub-recipients, then their policies and procedures at the project level must incorporate the ones that are included in the ESG written standards. That does not work the other way around. You cannot develop policies and procedures at the project level that are contrary or do not align with the local ESG written standards. It doesn't work that way. So anything that's in those ESG written standards must carry down into policies and procedures at the project level. Next slide, please. So if you receive an ESG subaward from California HCD, so if you are one of those local government subrecipients, and you're an ESG services provider, meaning that you provide direct services using that money, then you may be able to merge your ESG written standards and your project level policies and procedures into one document. Otherwise, your focus will likely be incorporating the existing ESG written standards into your separate policies and procedures manual. What I'm saying here is you can merge those into one document. I don't know that I would recommend that. Here is why. If you merge those things into the same document, you have to remember that everything in your ESG written standards will then become requirements for all of your sub-recipients if you should have any. So if you merge your project level policies and procedures into your ESG written standards document, then those project level policies and procedures then become requirements for all of your sub-recipients, effectively displacing any project level policies and procedures that they might have. So just keep that in mind if you're considering merging documents. I would recommend not doing that. I would recommend having separate ESG written standards and policies and procedures for any project for which you deliver direct services. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it back to Gordon to talk about some common scenarios.
That's very thoughtful. I thought you were going to steal the slide from me. And retribution, which would have been okay with me, I think. So common scenarios. HCD makes ESG awards to local government subrecipients and publishes guidance on its expectations, downstream of which the local government ESG subrecipient develops ESG written standards that meet HUD and HCD requirements, downstream of which local subrecipients, also called subgrantees, also called service providers, develop policies and procedures that incorporate all of the local ESG written standards and HCD requirements for the specific ESG components that are being funded. That is a pretty standard model of the way these policies trickle down to each rung of funding. Next slide, please. So as an example, HCD makes an ESG homelessness prevention award to a local government subrecipient and then publishes a homelessness prevention policy or policy guidance, something that has happened recently. The local government subrecipient, in response, develops ESG written standards incorporating HCD's policy guidance, or we should hope revises existing written standards to incorporate this new guidance, fingers crossed. In addition to which, it makes ESG homelessness prevention sub-awards to local service providers and sub-recipients, sub-grantees, or whatever you want to call them. At the sub-recipient or service provider or sub-grantee level, they develop homelessness prevention policies and procedures that incorporate the ESG written standards from the local sub-recipient and HCD policy guidance, and then deliver ESG homelessness prevention services that meet all of those requirements and provide great services to clients. Next slide, please. Now on to our lightning round, where all of you get to test your knowledge against yourself and see how much you have learned today. As a friendly reminder for the lightning round, we love to get your participation, and we encourage you to participate because you're really only testing yourself against yourself. We can't see individual answers, so please don't be worried that we might look into the audience and say, so-and-so didn't know the answer, naughty, naughty. We are simply excited for you to participate and see what you know and where you need to brush up. Next slide, please. Our first question during the lightning round. As the primary ESG recipient, California HCD is responsible for ESG written standards, but may pass this obligation down to sub-recipients. Has HCD elected to pass down this responsibility? And your answers are yes, no, and as always under ESG, not sure is an okay answer because it's a complicated grant funding source. And I do believe we have some polls for this. Okay, we may be having some technical difficulties on the polling end. There's our poll. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. You should see a poll in front of you. Go ahead and take a few seconds, review the question, and let us know what you think the answers are. And we're just, I think, reusing polls from a previous thing. Happily, yes, no, and not sure are the answers. So go ahead and submit your answer when you see it. Thank you very much, tech team. I see you in the background sorting things out, and we appreciate it very much. Jasmine, yes, you're correct. It doesn't match the question on the PowerPoint. Happily, the answers do. You're answering the question on the PowerPoint. Don't worry so much about what the poll screen says. Good catch, though. Appreciate it. Okay, if our poll master for the day has noticed that we've got some responses, they can go ahead and take it down when they're ready. All right, the overwhelming majority of you, 2/3 said the answer is yes. Can we get a click on the slide to have a look at the answer? Yes. HCD has, of course, elected to pass this responsibility down. We've said it 17 times today. Thank you to all of you who are sticking with it. That means that if you receive ESG funds directly from HCD, so if you are, for example, a local government subrecipient, you are required to develop and implement compliant ESG written standards, and they are, in fact, compliant with. None of you can answer, with, of course, the ESG program interim rule. Next slide, please, and back over to you, Mr. Michael Thomas.
Thank you, Gordon. So our next question is true or false? HUD publishes a list of all required policies and procedures that are required for agencies utilizing ESG funds. Is that true or false? There is a HUD list of all required policies and procedures. I think we have the same thing with this slide. Looks like the question doesn't quite match. And this is actually true or false, not yes or no. So
we're going to go with yes.
Now, sorry about that.
That's okay.
We'll get it figured out for the next poll. Sorry.
Cool. Well, I myself have confidence that our audience can translate true into yes and false into no. That's where my heart lies.
I'm good with that approach. All right, we have some answers there. I did not see them coming in and whatnot, so I'm going to assume this is it. Looks like 52% said no. That was the most popular. Let's take a look at the answer. So that would be false. And that is correct. It's false. There is no single list of all required policies and procedures. The ESG written standards do include some policies and procedures that are required for the entire area, but there is no single list published by HUD. Those that are required are generally derived from things like federal regulations, state requirements, local requirements, and requirements from other funders. However, it is best practice to not only focus on required policies and procedures, but on a full set of them that would allow a competent person to rebuild a program without guidance. So even if there were a list of required ones, you would probably need more than that, is what we're saying there. Next slide, please.
All right, that's back to me. True or false? ESG written standards developed by a local government subrecipient are applicable to all of its subrecipients. Is that true? Is it false? Or are you not sure? Let's see what the poll has. So we're still in a true is yes, false is no situation, not worrying about what the poll says, worrying about what the slide says. I have confidence in all of you. You're doing great so far. And once again, our tech team is in the background trying to sort this out, and we're very grateful for their work on this one. Did we do Jeopardy theme music during one of these at one point? I feel like we did, and replaced it with banter later, but I missed the Jeopardy theme. There should be a button, I feel like. All right, let's have a look. Cool. I think we did not get poll results this time. There it is. Overwhelmingly, you all said yes, which is of course correct. It is true. ESG written standards are applicable to all subrecipients of any given local government. The most common situation is when a local government subrecipient of HCD makes sub-awards to local agencies to deliver ESG services. That's the model we see all over the place. Next slide, please.
Okay, this one's a little trickier. If a county government receives direct ESG entitlement funding from HUD and also receives an ESG subaward from California HCD, is that local government required to develop 2 sets of ESG written standards? Is it required to develop 2 sets? Yes, no, or not sure, which is always a good answer option. So we are still not paying attention to the question on the poll there. Just pay attention to the one on your screen on the slide, and the answers are the same. Yes, no, or not sure.
See, I feel like we're in a good position here because we're really actively telling people what to pay attention to and like focused walking people through questions, which I feel like is getting us a great response right today. I feel like we should always have the wrong polls and have to actively talk people through these things. I think this is genius.
It requires active thought, right? You actually have to be thinking about the question because they're not matching. And I like that too.
There you go.
And it looks like 60% of you said no. So let's take a look at the answer. Well done. That was a trickier question, but it is in fact no. The county is not required to develop 2 sets of ESG written standards. It can develop 1 set in order to meet its obligations to both HUD and to HCD, provided that that 1 set meets all of the requirements of both funding sources. And next slide, back to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Where ESG written standards contain detailed procedures, is it okay to integrate those into your policies and procedures solely by reference? So solely by reference, meaning it says, refer to the written standards for your answer to this question. Are you allowed to do that? Is that okay? Is that yes, no, or are you not sure? Let's find out. There's a period in my life where I watched a lot of British like game shows, like British quiz shows, and so I feel like I'm channeling my inner Stephen Fry every time I get up here, or like my outer Stephen Fry. A reference few got. If you got that answer, please respond not sure.
Do I get to respond?
I'm always interested in what you have to say.
I enjoy Stephen Fry for a number of reasons.
Me too. Ooh. That's an almost even split between yes, no, and not sure. I'm proud of the third of you who said not sure. But a bare majority said yes. Let's have a look at the answer. The answer is yes. For items where the local ESG written standards contain detailed policies and procedures, agencies may integrate them by reference. Not only may, it's often a good idea. However, when doing this, remember that you are still required to follow these policies and procedures and update your practices whenever the ESG written standards are modified. Note also the caveat. It's not for all items. It's for items where the local ESG written standards contain detailed policies and procedures. So if the ESG written standards say, for example, you must develop a policy and procedure for X, you cannot include by reference in your policies and procedures that we must develop a policy and procedure for X, because you do not at that point have a policy and procedure for X. This is for situations like if the written standards have detailed, and I'm just making one up that isn't there, termination policies and procedures, which they do not have in most subrecipient communities. But if they do have detailed termination policies and procedures, you can adopt those by reference and follow them. But again, caution, you do need to make sure that when the written standards are updated, your policies and procedures, as well as your practices, are updated to reflect. Next slide, please.
All right, so we wanted to leave you after all of this today with just an overall summary of the responsibilities for these two concepts that we have talked about, something that you can refer to on one slide to understand what you should be doing. So for ESG written standards, the responsibility of California HCD, they elect to pass that responsibility down. So while they are the ESG recipient, they pass it to subrecipients. So if you are a subrecipient or an administrative entity, as I have termed it here, you must develop ESG written standards for your local area. If you are a subrecipient of that administrative entity, then you must abide by the local ESG written standards that have been developed, and you must develop project level policies and procedures that incorporate local ESG written standards and all of the other policies and procedures that would be necessary for someone sitting down in your chair if you weren't there to reconstruct the program. That is your responsibility at that level. For project level policies and procedures, California HCD publishes guidance on those. Homelessness prevention is a great example. They have published guidance on the requirements for your project level policies and procedures. The administrative entity, the subrecipient, must ensure that all of the sub-subrecipients have developed project level policies and procedures that comply with HCD's guidance, and they must also develop their own project level policies and procedures if they deliver direct services. And then all sub-subrecipients must develop project level policies and procedures that comply with the guidance from HCD. So if you want to reference any one slide from this presentation going forward to get a quick view of what your responsibilities are for either of these things, this is the one you can go to. Next slide, please. And that takes us into Q&A. I have not seen any questions, but I will defer to our gracious moderator to let me know if I've missed anything.
Nope, I think you're right. As of right now, I don't see any questions either. there anyone that has a question that would like to unmute themselves?
So LaQuantia, we're getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm literally going to echo that. In the event that there are any questions that y'all haven't asked yet, we are happy to take them in the chat, or you can feel free to come off mute and ask them directly with your human voice. Either direction, we are more than happy to answer. And this is an area in which this is a complicated area with a lot of nuance. And so I want to be really clear that asking a question here is an okay thing to do because you're trying to tease out nuance that is not well articulated elsewhere. So we really encourage you to think, do I have a question that could in theory be asked no matter how complex or how seemingly small? This is a great opportunity for you to ask that question. We really do want to help cover those if they're out there. But we're not going to pull your teeth on it. So last call on questions of any kind in relation to written standards and policies and procedures, knowing that you yourselves will be in a position to develop at least one of those ongoingly as you receive ESG. All right, I think that shuts down the Q&A, and I believe I'm tossing it back to Taylor, but I might be tossing it back to LaQuantia. Either direction, back over to you folks.
Thank you, Gordon. And thank you everyone for attending today. Please remember that a quick survey will pop up at the end of the presentation once you hit exit. And please do take a few minutes to answer those questions for us because your feedback is really, really important to us. Thank you again and see you next week.